Welcome back to an introduction to ethics. We have finally arrived at my favorite philosopher and one of my favorite ethical theories, Aristotle and virtue ethics. This is a really long presentation. I was just looking over the PowerPoint that I usually use in the classroom to go over the material, and there are several hundred slides, so I am going to skim over a number of them, but I also figure it's a good idea to break this presentation into two videos so that you don't have to sit through an entire who knows how long video. But we are getting closer to the end of this course, and we've already introduced a lot of the competing theories, and as we've gone through, you probably noticed that I bring up Aristotle quite a bit. So finally, we're going to get a chance to delve into his theory on virtue ethics. There are other versions of virtue ethical theory, but his is probably the most influential historically speaking. As you can see on the screen, this is, again, a teleological system in that it is related to goals and ends. In particular, these are going to be the goals and ends that are inherent within human nature. So as we go through this presentation, we're going to point out a number of things that really have to do with the human soul as far as Aristotle is concerned. And we are going to have to talk a little bit about some of the metaphysical concepts that go into this understanding of human nature in general. And I think we've gone through a bit of this when we did the fact-value distinction response video a while back. But if you want to pay attention very carefully here, again, the slide that you're looking at really just goes back through the word telos, what that means. Some of this, again, is review. As you see, some of the same things on this slide that were on the slide when we introduced consequentialist ethics earlier. So as I was saying, we're grouping theories as teleological into a couple of different categories. You've got the consequentialist theories, which we've already spent some time with: egoism, altruism, and utilitarianism. And then the virtue theories, which I'm separating off, and I'm going to put natural law into that category, even though natural law is slightly different. We'll talk about that as the very last lecture of this series. So right now, let's go into virtue ethics a little bit more in depth. I'm going to do, like I said, an introduction. We'll look at the 6 big questions of the moral philosopher, and then I'll use that as a way to introduce some of the concepts that we're going to unpack as we go on a little bit later. Virtue ethic, obviously teleological, as I said, is a non-consequentialist theory. So here we have a theory that is not considering the actual ends, in that we're looking at what results from a particular action, right? We're not looking at the consequences. Utilitarianism, egoism, altruism, you tend to evaluate the action based on whether the consequences are good or whether the consequences are bad. This is non-consequential. So if an action doesn't result in the consequences you hope it does, it doesn't necessarily mean what you did was wrong. Okay, so it's not concerned directly with the right action. It is teleological, as I said, because it relates to the human nature and the ends inherent in that, which are going to be towards the ultimate end of the person, which is going to be happiness, or eudaimonia, a term that we looked at when we talked about Epicurus. So we're going to come back to that. We're going to see how Epicurus's version of eudaimonia and Aristotle's idea of eudaimonia are a little bit different. Okay, so it's teleological because it's concerned with goods and one's ultimate end, and directly concerned with your character. Okay, when you hear the word virtue, I think a lot of people start to think of personality traits, right? If it's a virtuous individual, we tend to think they have certain characteristics and behave in certain ways. And that's really what Aristotle's after here. He's interested in an ethical theory where the person, it becomes a type of person, okay, or a person of noble character, okay, or good character, or however you want to describe the word he uses as an aesthetic term, kalos, which is beautiful. Okay, so character is going to be related to the natural ends, like I said, inherent in your nature, and particularly in the faculties of one's nature. So we're going to unpack that as well. Virtue ethics focuses not on right and wrong acts, but on good and bad character. Not what to do, but really how to be. Because what you do actually relates to your being, and it kind of flows and follows from it. So the goal of life is not to do certain things, but to be a certain type of person. Virtue ethics was the dominant mode of moral reasoning among the ancient Greeks. And it's not only Aristotle who was interested in virtue. A lot of the Greeks were. And again, a lot of the Greeks focused on the ultimate goal of happiness, as we said before, though they have different methods to hopefully attain that end. So good action follows from a balanced and moderate character that knows how to respond in different situations. And how you respond is going to have to do a lot with your emotions and a lot with your reasoning process. So for Aristotle, the emotions or the desires and the reasoning or deliberation are going to be the two things that come together to result in an action that's going to be appropriate given the situation. Aristotle identifies and analyzes the virtues that make up the good life. And a lot of these you're probably already very well familiar with. They're the cardinal virtues, things like wisdom, self-control, generosity, and among others, bravery, for example. Now, each virtue is appropriately moderate in response to tendencies to go in either direction of what we might call excess and defect. They're the extremes, what we call vices. So we're going to contrast vices and virtues as we go along. And of course, for him, a virtue is going to be this middle point. If he's calling it moderate, it's going to be a middle point between two extremes, which he would call vices. And the virtue is going to be a solid character trait. That's a reliable character trait. You don't have it one moment and then it's gone the next. It should basically govern how you are over the long haul, and it's built up through a process that we're going to call habituation. It's not something you're born with, it's something you develop. Okay, nobody is born virtuous. As a matter of fact, we would say you're born virtuously blank. Okay, that needs to be created within you, the virtues. Not created, but you know what I mean, developed within you. Virtue theory gets its appeal from our common wish to be good people. Even bad people tend to think of themselves as good people. If you're ever asked, are you a good person? Most people are going to say, yeah, I think I'm basically a good person. Well, this is what we're after. We're of course, it's not just our belief that we're a good person. We're actually have the goal of actually being a good person. And our frequent practice of approaching problems with a particular thought. So, and this is actually one of the areas where Aristotle's theory becomes critiqued by many people. It doesn't give us straightforward rules as to how you make decisions, like utilitarianism with its, the greatest good for the greatest number principle. We want to know, okay, what would you do in a certain situation? And the solution, Aristotle would say, is to look at what a virtuous man would do. Okay, so the question we would come up with all the time is, okay, what would so-and-so do? If I could find the virtuous man as my model, then I can imitate that. And it's not in imitating that I'm doing a virtuous thing necessarily, if I'm myself not virtuous, but in imitating that, it's a process of becoming virtuous. I'm learning, I'm training, I'm habituating by doing the right thing until it becomes ingrained within me. So, classic example, I think you've probably heard this. There were bracelets that were really popular for quite a while. The WWJD bracelet, what would Jesus do? Very popular among Christian evangelicals. The whole idea, of course, Jesus being the most virtuous individual. So, what would he do? And that's kind of the guide that you have for what you should do as well. Maybe taking a less lofty example, besides Jesus, maybe you'd ask yourself, what would Batman do? It's not quite the same standard that we're setting there, but maybe at least a decent starting point if you consider Batman to be a virtuous individual. Now, not sure what was there, but I will move on in the PowerPoint. What I'm approaching at this point is the introduction. I know I've been doing an introduction, but I'm going to start with those 6 questions, like I said, that you've seen in the previous videos, or at least in the previous PowerPoints, even though I skimmed them in the videos. Now, as I was talking about this, what would the virtuous man do question, this seems to be, like I said, one of the weaknesses of the critiques that people bring against virtue ethics, because it doesn't give us, again, a direct rule. We're not sure exactly what the virtuous man would do. Even when we look at somebody like Jesus or Batman and find yourself in a certain situation, it's not always easy to figure out, well, what would they have done in that situation if we don't actually have an example of them being in that exact same situation. Okay, so it's not as easy to make ethical decisions, and some people have a problem with that. Let's see this as a deficiency in virtue ethics. Now, obviously, I mentioned Aristotle in the very beginning. One of the greatest, if not the greatest philosopher who has ever lived. Plato is usually put right up there at the top, and everybody has been a philosopher ever since, in a way, responds to Plato and the things that he brought up. Well, Aristotle was one of the first people to respond to Plato, since he was a direct pupil of Plato. Studied at the academy for about 20 years, yet had incredible disagreements with his mentor, and disagrees on a number of very fundamental issues. His metaphysics, his epistemology, etc. deviate. But he is still, I'd say, at least as important as Plato, historically speaking. As a matter of fact, he was so popular that during the Middle Ages, at least among the Christians, they simply referred to him as the philosopher. And I guess I'm talking about the Middle Ages, once Aristotelian philosophy was reintroduced to Europe. So when you read, for instance, Thomas Aquinas, when he talks about the philosopher, he's talking about Aristotle. Anyways, his dates, 384 BC to 322 BC. He was born a year after the academy opened and died about a year after Alexander the Great, who was his most famous student. And he wrote extensively on numerous topics, and I think the only ones that we have left of his writings happen to be the writings that were compiled by his students, which were probably based on his lecture notes and such. So we've got him writing in logic and physics and metaphysics, ethics and politics, which we kind of group together, rhetoric, and on it goes. He's prolific, to use a fancy term. Now, under ethics, you'll notice that there are a few different works that deal with ethics and politics, but the one that I've got underlined and kind of italicized and bold-faced all for you just to emphasize, the Nicomachean Ethics. This is where you get the core ideas that are important for his virtue theory. Not that you get all of his ideas relevant to virtue theory from that one work, but this is the most important ethical work that he produced. Okay, so you'll see off and on in the PowerPoint, if I've got a quote or a reference to where you can find some information. I don't do this all the time, but you'll see NE, which refers to Nicomachean Ethics. Now, the 6 questions. Virtue ethics, like we said, is going to be grounded in human nature. So we're going to need to take a look at the psychology question, which is always the first question anyways. And we're going to talk about virtue as what we would say is a perfection in an individual, or an actualization of a potency in a certain way. And these are terms that I may have used. I don't think I really got into act potency distinctions or even the idea of perfection of a faculty yet, but it's going to take a little bit of time to get used to this terminology. So I will be doing that fairly early on as we progress. So the first question is the moral psychology question. As an introduction, we're going to be looking mainly at what makes up the human being, human nature, as far as faculties go, particularly in the desiderative and intellective faculties. So we're going to be talking a lot about desire and intellect as necessary conditions for producing human action. So we're going to unpack that. You'll see us talk about the practical syllogism, us as if there's more than one person talking, but you'll see me talking about the practical syllogism over and over again. So I'm going to kind of go through these, like I said, fairly quickly. The content question is going to deal with really the issue of character that is going to emerge in the course of producing a virtuous person. We're going to have a couple types of virtue, moral virtue and intellectual virtue, that we will discuss. Justification question deals with the function of that character, and of course the ultimate pleasure that we're after, and the ultimate happiness that we're after, which is also part of the motivation question, number 4. This idea of going after eudaimonia, whichever definition we're going to use, we'll unpack that later. A little discussion on the virtuous person versus the non-virtuous types of characters. So the vicious person, and one that we'll spend a little bit more time on, which is the incontinent person, which happens to be where I think most people tend to fall. The ontological source question obviously has to do with the grounding, or the basis of this whole theory, which is going to be, again, grounded in our human nature and various potentials that come along with it. And then the moral education question, which is going to address how you become a virtuous person, what kind of training is going to be involved, possibly the role of mentors, examples. Aristotle even talks a bit about the training that would be necessary for the government to provide, and the types of things that go along with that. I'm not really going to unpack that so much as the PowerPoint progresses, but this first part of the PowerPoint, if you go back through that, you could read through on your own kind of the role of the government and the various types of education that he recommends to become a virtuous person. Okay. Throw in this little thought experiment. I don't really know if this is a fair thought experiment to have you think through, but I guess it gets you thinking a little bit about what we're talking about when it comes to virtue. And the question is really this. Imagine a world 1 and world 2, which we're going to contrast as having a certain set of people in it. In world 1, everybody has this desire to harm people, which doesn't sound like a very pleasant place. But what makes it even worse is that the people that have those desires are also bold enough to act on those desires. Maybe we could say they have some type of courage, right, to act even when it might be risky, because harming people is dangerous, especially when they can retaliate, right? So that's world number 1. It becomes a very violent place, obviously. World number 2 has the same desires. Everybody still desires to harm people, but what they lack is the boldness or maybe courage to actually act upon that desire. So the world is ultimately fairly peaceful. And the question is, which world is morally better? Now, again, you could stop and think about this. One thing I think everybody would agree on is it's probably more pleasant to live on world 2. Safer, at least. You're not going to be murdered in your sleep by your neighbor or even your children. Very common thing in Greek mythology. Since we're talking about Aristotle, might as well talk about children murdering their parents. But maybe this isn't even a fair question. Maybe it's not possible to just add up the various individual people and then conclude that there's a certain moral characteristic of the world itself. Aristotle, I don't know that he would do that at all, since he's interested, again, in the moral individual, the virtuous person, per se. And we'll see by the end of the second video that the ideas of desires or your moral virtue is intimately connected with your intellectual virtue, and it's that you can't have virtues that exist kind of in a vacuum, where you have one virtue while you lack all the other virtues. It doesn't make you a virtuous person. So thinking about the two situations from, I guess, the reflection that I've done, I don't think any world is necessarily a more virtuous world. I think the people in both worlds are pretty poor if their desires are vicious to the core, which seems to be the case here. Boldness in most situations, or bravery in many situations in our world, seems to be a good thing. But it's not a good thing when it comes to wrong desires and being able to act upon them. So again, just something to think about, because you do hear a lot of people talk about this, best of all possible worlds type of thinking. Can you imagine a world which would be better than this world? And what would that entail? Is it just a matter, again, of adding up the amount of evil actions? Because we could always imagine a world with one fewer evil action, and we consider that maybe a better possible world. But I don't think that thinking is necessarily applicable to virtue theory. So I just threw that in as just to get you thinking. Anyways, let's dive into Aristotelian virtue theory in more detail now. And I'm going to start with moral psychology. As a matter of fact, we're going to start with the moral psychology and look at that for most of the 2 videos. So first, we're going to begin with the knowledge of first principles. First principles are not something that are naturally known. Okay? They're not grasped intuitively in Aristotle's viewpoint. It's not something that's apprehended by perceiving the world or a process of induction where we derive these things. It's not observed. Our knowledge of first principles comes via the habituation of the character. So the prudent person, the person of wisdom, possesses knowledge because his character has been transformed to a certain degree so that it grasps morality. You can't grasp morality if your character is not in a particular situation, okay? So if there's no training, then there's no understanding. And maybe you could even ask the person, why should I be a good person? You don't know the answer to that question until you have developed the virtues where you understand the value of being a good person and the benefits of being virtuous, or the fact that virtue is connected completely with one's own true happiness. Now, there are different levels of character refinement. Aristotle talks about the hoi polloi, or just the general, the many, the barbarians, or basically the non-Greeks at his time. And they identify good with pleasure. So it sounds a little bit like Epicurus, even though he wasn't a barbarian. And ultimately, these don't seem to be any better than lower animals, which operate on a sensual level. Human beings, of course, have a level above that because of our rationality. So you can have more refinement. So the more refined might identify the good with something like honor. Okay, the truly refined, that's what we're after, is a virtuous man, is going to identify good with the virtues. Okay, so the virtuous man, who we could also call the prudent man, is going to be in a position where they can see the good of virtue for its own sake, not for the sake of some higher good, the way Epicurus did, right? Epicurus says the virtues are important, but they're important instrumentally so that you can achieve the happiness which identified with pleasure, which again, as a negative concept, was an absence of pain for him. But Aristotle doesn't see it that way. He can understand the life of virtue is a better life than a life of bodily pleasure. And the life in accord with virtue can redeem those other things. You could have honor in the right way. You could have pleasure in the right way. But it all hinges on your character. So like I said, the moral psychology. How are choices made? Well, since we're interested in choosing rightly, we need to figure out what goes into making a human choice. And that's the first question we're going to ask. You have to know how choices are made before we can learn to choose rightly, and that's going to depend on our anthropology. Remember, anthropology, philosophically, is just the study of what it means to be human, and Aristotle had a particular metaphysic in mind. So for Aristotle, human beings are what we call hylomorphic composites. A hylomorphic anthropology is what we need to describe. So we're talking a union of two principles, neither of which are things in themselves. They're not substances, I guess we could say. Things is a fine word. They're composed of form and matter in union. Okay, so hylomorphic literally just means form, matter, composition. Now, all substances, or corporeal substances at least, sensible, are composed of those two principles, which I have on the screen. Form, or morphe, in the hylomorphic, and matter, or hule, and see both of those Greek words in hylomorphic. Form is that according to which a thing is a type of thing. All right, so that according to which one type of thing is distinguished from another type of thing. So, for instance, a tree, to be distinguished from a dog, is done so on the basis that the tree has a form that is different from the form that we have in a dog, or the form that we have in a human being. Okay, that has to deal with the essential nature of the thing, or the essence of the subject, or substance rather, is rooted in its form. All right, so we could say, maybe in a more colloquial way, that form is associated with your whatness. Okay, what you are is determined. Quiddity is kind of a fancy Latin-ish term that's brought up later in philosophical history to refer to this whatness. Okay, we could also say the form is what actualizes the matter, what brings the matter into actual existence as, again, a living substance or thing, if we're talking about living things. Matter is not a principle of what you are, but it's a principle, we'd say, of individuation. It's what makes one thing of a kind distinct from another thing of the same kind. Okay, so it's that according to which a substance of the same type are distinguished from one another. So when you have multiple trees, one tree is distinct from another tree, not because of its form, because that's what they have in common, but because of its matter, which allows the form to exist in a limited form in this place, while the matter of the other tree allows that form to exist quite independently in a different place. So we could say the matter is going to account for the thisness of the thing. Not what it is, but that it's this one particular example of what we're talking about. Okay, and you could also refer to it as the potential to be formed, as opposed to the actualization. All right, so those are the two basic concepts, metaphysically speaking, and I know that's a lot. Right there, you could spend a whole probably semester studying and trying to wrap your mind around those concepts, but we don't have time to do that. So let's move a little further and show how those two things exist in a human being under slightly different terms. Anyways, this next slide, which I just noticed, like I said, form and matter aren't things in themselves. They don't exist independently. They only exist in union, which is why we call them principles or constituents of things. The only thing that's real is the composite, the substance itself. Form can't actually exist without matter, and matter cannot exist without form, at least as far as human beings are concerned with what we're talking about now. There are some exceptions to this, but it's not going to be relevant to ethics. So this is where we get into human nature in particular, because what I just talked about, form and matter, those are fine when we talk about things in general, but specifically when it comes to living beings, living substances, we are going to give specific terms: soul and body. Soul corresponding to the form and body corresponding to the matter. So soul, or psyche, body, soma in the Greek. So the soul is that in virtue of which a thing basically exists, a living thing would exist. It's in virtue of which living substances get their character. So you can give a form-matter definition of the soul, and it's the form of a body in the order of a substance with life potentially in it. So again, we're talking about the soul as a form of a body. You could also give an act potency this definition, and we really haven't talked about act and potency yet, but first grade actuality of a body possessed of organs, and that the soul is primary, again, in the actualization of the substance. That might be more than we need, right? So look at the body very quickly. That in virtue of which a thing of the same type is individuated. So human beings, this is my body, that's your body, we're in different places. We could also define it kind of a form-matter definition as a potential, an act potency definition, the potential to receive a soul. All right, so the body is literally informed by the soul, or ensouled, and there you have a living being. Okay, so soul, body, just think of them as form and matter. For our purposes, we'll probably refer most of the time to the soul and the body. Just like form and matter are not things in themselves, neither are soul and body. And by the way, when I'm talking about soul, I don't want you to think in the context of Christianity or Islam or anything like that, or a religious concept necessarily at all, because Aristotle doesn't believe in an immortal soul or in a soul that's going to continue to live on after the body dies. For him, the soul is just as temporary as the body is. Okay, these are purely philosophical categories for him. All right, and they're constituents. They're things that bring together. The soul doesn't live apart from the body, and the body doesn't live apart from the soul. But there are different types of souls among living things, right? So the soul is a principle of life. You only find souls in living things, but you do find lots of different living things, from plants to animals to human beings, at the top in a sort of hierarchy. And we can arrange the souls hierarchically as well, based on general function. So at the lowest level, Aristotle would give us what's called the vegetative soul, or the nutritive soul. And it has certain faculties, which are going to be used interchangeably with the terms powers, abilities, capacities. All right, so a faculty is an ability something has, or a power something has to do something. So for instance, in the vegetative soul, you've got the powers of nutrition, the the powers of growth, right? That allows something like a plant to take in nutrients and to grow and do what a plant needs to do. So that's a typical example, plants. The second higher level up would be the sensitive or perceptual soul, which is above the vegetative soul, and that we have additional faculties that we see here. So it has all the general faculties of the nutritive or vegetative soul, but it also has additional things like desires, emotions, the ability to move, and those would be possessed by more complex animals. And at the top, at the highest level, you have what's called the rational or intellectual soul. And this is going to be with the added faculties, again, all of the general faculties of the lower souls, plus the added rationality and intellectual powers that we find within man. And man will be the ultimate example of the rational soul. Act and potency within the soul have to do with, again, where those faculties are. This is going to take a little bit of time to break through, but I'll just read through some of these slides to get us going. But act and potency, since I've introduced the terms, they're not constituents like form and matter. They're features of composite substances, and they happen to deal with relations between certain aspects of a being with other aspects of a being. And they are there to really to allow us to be able to explain change over time and change while retaining identity. Very important questions that the ancient Greeks were wrestling with. So act and potency are very important concepts metaphysically. To define them, we're going to do it this way, an energia, or act, or actuality. So again, interchangeably, we could use the word act and actuality, and I will probably do that. It has to do with the thing's being, its existence. So we say that which is in a state of existence is in a state of act. It's also a perfection. The motion, change, or activity that is a fulfillment of a potency or possibility. So potencies are tending towards actuality. But of course, one of the main rules metaphysically is something in potency cannot be actualized unless it's actualized by something that is already in act. This is ultimately the principle of causation in Aristotelian terms. So act is going to be primarily important. Potency or potentiality or dunamis is really the capacity to be actualized. It's an ability to be realized. So power, capacity, potential, all used interchangeably to be actualized. Okay, or it could even be the power to affect change in oneself or in somebody else. And there's several different types of potency, which I'll get to in a second here. We could also consider it a limitation of being. So it's a capacity. It's real, but it's not as real as act in a certain sense. So the two types of potency that need to be distinguished are what we call a passive and an active potency. A passive potency, we'll say, is an ability to be acted upon. So just think verbs. When you have a passive verb like throw, that's not a passive verb, but the verb to throw. To be thrown is a passive form of that verb, right? It's like the ball is being thrown. It's actually being acted upon, as opposed to me throwing the ball or I'm doing the action. One's passive, one's active. So if that helps you understand the difference between passive potency and active potency, use that as an example. But a passive potency, again, is an ability to be acted upon or a capacity to be changed, the potential to be. Where an active potency is the ability to act or a capacity to cause the change, or it's a potential to do. Okay, a productive power, we would say. So keep those in mind, because certain things we're going to be looking at are passive potencies, a very important part of ethics, particularly the emotions, and we'll unpack that later. So you need to understand what a potency is before we can unpack what the emotions are, for instance. Now, the faculties of the soul in potency and act. Potencies of the soul enable certain faculties of the soul. The faculties of the soul are often simply called potencies or abilities. And most faculties of the soul are active, right? The potency for the performance of certain activities. The faculties of the soul need to remain, they need not remain merely potential. In other words, we can bring them into act. We can perfect them by bringing them into different states of potency. And I'm going to have to talk about this, and I'll actually give you some charts as well in a second. But the faculty of the soul can be in two states. You've got a state of potency and a state of act. We'll call the state of potency the faculty prior to us exercising or using the faculty, whereas the faculty in a state of act is it being utilized or actually exercised. And faculties may be in both states at the same time, but relevant to different things. That's why I said these terms have to do with relative relationships, but you know what I mean, between different aspects of the soul. So a faculty in potency can be in one of two states. You could have a first grade potency or a second grade potency. And I also added the terms here, a natural state, meaning this is kind of where we're brought into existence in a natural state. Pre-developmental, maybe we could say, that's your first grade potency. So children have the potential in a natural state to speak even before they learn to do it. Second grade potency would be the perfected state. So again, take that same child, once they start to learn the language and practice and develop, they're moving from their natural state to a perfected state, and their first grade potency to a second grade potency. Faculty can also be in a state of act, first grade actuality or second grade actuality, whether we're talking about merely the existence of a power. So the fact that my power of speech exists even when I'm not using it is a certain level of actuality in that it is there in existence, but it's in a second grade state of actuality as I'm actually using it. So right now, my power of speech is in a state of actualization at that second level because I'm talking, probably more than you want to hear. So as an example, using the faculty of speech on the next slide, and I sometimes go over this when I'm talking in class because I'm already throwing examples out there, but I'll just read through it. And if this makes sense, good for you. If not, don't spend too much time getting frustrated by it. But the soul, we would say, is in a first grade actuality. I'm getting tongue-tied. So its existence, for instance, precedes the abilities that one has, right? You can't have the faculty without prior existing. So that's why the soul is this first grade actuality. It's got to be there prior to actualizing any potentials in the soul or the faculties. The power of speech, we said, is a second grade actuality relative to the soul, which is primary. But the power of speech is a first grade actuality relative to the use of that power, in that it exists even before it's being actualized. That's why I said this is relative to different things. Using the power of speech or actually speaking is a second grade actuality relative to merely having the power. Faculty of speech, however, is a first grade potential with respect to speaking Spanish, for instance, in somebody who doesn't know how to speak Spanish, or with respect to speaking at all with regard to the child, which I mentioned before. And the ability to speak Spanish might be considered a second grade potential for those that have learned the language but aren't actually speaking it at the moment, but it actually becomes a second grade actuality when that person then speaks Spanish. So if that helps, like I said, good for you. God bless you. I may have just made it more confusing than it needed to be, but at least we're talking about act and potency. It might be easier just to give you an illustration, which is probably where I should have gone off the bat. So this may be a little small depending on your screen. I got it broken down into 3 columns here: the soul, the faculty, and the act. And I will break this down further later because I'm not distinguishing the faculties in different stages of potential here. I just have the first grade potential. So again, the soul in the column, first grade actuality, the faculty, first grade potential, and the act, a second grade actuality. So if you look at the faculty column, which is really the most important column here, when we're talking about first grade potential, we're talking about just you in your natural state. You have the power of speech. You have the capacity to reason. You have the ability to run, even when you're a toddler, right? Now, and we have those abilities because we have a particular type of soul. That's why it's in relation to the soul. Because it's a human soul, those faculties kind of come along with the package. The act column, we're looking at second grade act. So we would say that you actually will actualize that potency of speech when you give a speech. You actualize the potency of reasoning when you actually use your reason. You actualize the potency of running when you actually go for a run. Okay, so that's, again, the relationship. That's all I'm trying to illustrate there. Don't worry about the bottom part of the chart. Now, this is all relevant to the talk of virtues, because virtue is going to be a type of perfection in a potency. So the first question we could ask is, when it comes to faculties and virtues, where's the locus of the virtue? Where is the virtue actually found? Well, it's either got to be found in one of those three places. Like I said here, we've got the soul, the faculty, or the act. Well, the virtue is either in the soul, in the faculty, or in the act itself. It's not in the soul, we could reason, because if it was in the soul, then everybody would be virtuous just in virtue of having a soul. It's not in the act itself, because if it were, then every identical act would be a virtuous act, regardless of who's committing that act. All right, we could actually do something unconsciously in a way that would not be virtuous. I don't know if this is a great example, but I just thought, a person who can see the danger and walks towards it on the battlefield, for instance, is demonstrating a certain virtue that we say is bravery. But you take a person who does not perceive the danger, put them in that situation, say a blind man who just happens to be walking in the same direction. So the action literally is the same, walking towards a danger, but the virtue is not in the action, obviously. Where the virtue is, of course, would then have to be the faculty. It's in the powers themselves. But the next question is, what's the nature of the virtue? What is that? In the faculty, it has to be either a passion, the faculty, or the state of character. So we just said that the virtue is in the faculty, but is that identical to the faculty is, I guess, the next question. Is it our passions? Is it our faculties? Is it in our character? Nicomachean Ethics 2.5 was where you could find his discussion of this. Well, it's not in your passions. The virtue is not in the passions or the appetites, emotions, etc. Because you're not virtuous merely by having passions or just by feeling, right? Because we do these things without a choice, ultimately speaking, all right? Okay, so when I feel an emotion, it's not that I choose to feel it at that time, okay? And the virtue is not the faculties themselves, because like I said, all of us have the same faculties, but not all of us are virtuous, okay? That in virtue of which you're capable of feeling the passions, that's what a faculty is. But you're not virtuous because we're able, again, to have those feelings. What the virtue is, like I said, a state of your character or a disposition of the faculty. It's that in virtue of which one stands well or poorly with respect to your passions. Okay, at least a certain type of virtue that we're talking about, which is what we're going to call moral virtue, has to do with how we handle our emotions, all right, our disposition in regards to them. And that does involve a choice, the choice to be a certain type of person. And we'll see later when I say you can't choose your emotions. On a certain level, that's true. But in another way, we can choose our emotions, in that we can choose to train ourselves to develop the character that handles those emotions in a different way. So now that we've gotten to this idea of virtue, I'm going to give you an informal definition based on act and potency. We can call virtue a second-grade potential. A second-grade potential, which, like I said, is a perfected state as opposed to our natural state. So it's the perfection of a faculty, refinement and ordering, a state of character. This is what we're after. Some examples. Passions, the first grade passive potentiality could be the capacity to be made to feel angry. Right? We all have that capacity. Second grade passive potential might be the perfected capacity to be made to feel anger, but we do it in the right times, at the right intensity, at the right reasons, at the right things. Anger is not necessarily a bad thing. It's how the anger is dealt with and whatever. So it really is related again to the virtue. It is appropriate to be angry at certain things, injustices. You should be angry, and you should be angry at the right intensity. So that's a good example of a second grade passive potential or a virtue. When it comes to actions, of course, examples would be, first grade potential would be the ability to shape clay. right? You got some piece of clay, a little kid could do something with it, but they're not going to be able to do the same amazing things that a artist who has been trained on the potter's wheel can do, right? They could throw this amazing vase that in no time at all. I've never been able to do that. But as a second grade act of potency, the ability to shape clay into a work of art. And that also is a virtue. That's an intellectual virtue. Okay? The first type, the anger, is a moral virtue. They deal with different types of faculties. So we're going to have to unpack moral versus intellectual virtue. Now, we could also talk about change as a development. And there's 4 types of change we could talk about. There's a substantial change, which is a change in a substance. We could talk about generation or corruption. So you can think of it as a person being conceived or a person dying and decaying. That would be a substantial change. Or when we replace one form with another. One example being a human sperm becoming a human being. You can even have an accidental substantial change maybe when, no, I'll not even go there just because it might be a contradiction. The second would be an accidental change, which is a change in a substance without changing the substance. Okay, so this would be a development or an alteration, such as a change in quality. It could be an augmentation, which would be a change in quantity. So, for instance, I can get taller as I grow. Could be local motion. It's another type of change, a movement from one place to another. Now, the important one here is going to be the development, right? So again, substantial change, and then there are 3 under accidental change, which is why I said there are 4 types of changes. The one we're concerned with is the development or alteration of a qualitative change. That is the development of a virtue. So it's an accidental change whereby a potency is perfected. Okay, that's actually in his work on the soul. So again, not in Nicomachean Ethics, which is why I said before, lots of what Aristotle says about ethics can be found in other works, not just in his ethical writings. Now, ethical development is what we're concerned with specifically. To become a good or virtuous person, it doesn't involve removing something and replacing it. Okay, like getting rid of your form. We don't want to get rid of you as a human being or get rid of your human nature or essence. So it's not losing a nature, a soul, or a faculty. And it's not suppressing something. We talked about Kant. His whole idea is, you need to kind of ignore the desires, right? Suppress the desires and just do your duty. It does involve improvement. Where Kant may not have believed we can improve our desires, Aristotle does. How is this done is the challenging question. Well, the movement from natural state to perfected state is accomplished by things like actually participating in the arts, going through training, tutoring, learning various skills. There's an intellectual perfected process that involves reasoning, learn logic. And there's also the character and the moral perfection that is developed through habituation or doing the deeds a virtuous person would do. Do the brave action until it's ingrained within you and you become brave interiorly, right? Because we could act brave even without being brave. So it's this process of habituation that internalizes these character traits. He does have a doctrine of human imperfection. And again, this is not a religious idea like, the fall of man in Judeo-Christian tradition or something like that. Humans by nature are not morally praiseworthy, right? Our natural state is not the same as a virtuous state because it's pre-developmental. Man left to himself is going to be ignorant, all right? Man left to himself is ultimately a savage. And, of course, when we perfect man, he becomes the best of all animals instead of the basest of all animals. But the problem is we lack the potential to do this on our own, which is why there is this idea that humans left on their own are never going to become virtuous individuals. So moral goodness, which is what we're perfecting, is we could think of this as an achievement, right? If you have become a virtuous, a brave person, if you become a wise person, if you become a generous person, that's an accomplishment, right? And where Kant says, it's not praiseworthy if you do something out of your character, out of your disposition. It's praiseworthy if you do something out of your duty. Aristotle says, no, it's praiseworthy to have that character in the first place because that's not a natural thing. Okay? So you can actually be proud when you're brave. Okay, you can be proud when you're generous. You can be proud that you've attained a certain perfection in your character. I think this is a very attractive aspect of Aristotle's thinking. So it's, again, this acquired second nature. And the reason we call it a second nature, right, your natural state, move to your perfected state, but it's called a second nature because it feels like it's natural. Right? It's become so ingrained within us, those habits feel as if we've been born with them. And that's what we want. That's why a virtue should be an enduring thing. Right? This becomes the new way of being. And it influences our new way of doing and choosing. So this next chart here kind of unpacks by adding a second column, faculty 1, faculty or the faculty column, the first faculty column with first grade potency and the second grade potency in the second column. So you can ignore soul and act here, but as we're moving from natural state to perfected state, notice that I have the word virtue, nice red kind of highlighted there for you. That's what we're after. So it's not the power of speech, but it's the ability to speak eloquently. It's not the capacity to reason, but the capacity to reason properly. It's not the ability to run, but it's the ability to run fast and efficiently. Right? So those are perfections in the faculties. That is what a virtue is. And if you want to stop and kind of look at that chart or go to the PowerPoint, which if you're in my class, you have a copy of, again, look and study that. If, spending time with these things, it'll start to fit into place. Okay. One thing I love about Aristotle and Plato is they've got a system where things fit neatly and tightly together. Not that they're perfect systems, but they're more rigorous than a system like Epicurus, for instance, just to contrast Greek thinkers with Greek thinkers. The types of faculties and their respective virtues, because since you've got different types of faculties, I already mentioned there's different types of virtues. Faculties can be divided into two broad categories. We've got cognitive faculties and non-cognitive faculties. And the virtues are going to be broken down into two broad categories as well, your moral virtues and your intellectual virtues. And the moral virtues we'll take first. Like I said, not suppressing an appetite, but a perfection of an appetite, an emotion, or a wish. So it's a refinement. So that we could say that the emotion is the right emotion or the right appetite. Because they can be good or bad, depending on how they're ordered. Like I said, Kant and the utilitarians don't have this particular view, so I'm going to jump past this. But self-mastery is really the key here. When it comes to the emotions, Kant's right, we do need to control them, but not suppress them. Okay, so one of the great virtues, of course, is the virtue of temperance or self-control. The ability to hold those things and deal with things in the right way. But that is a perfection, not just a repression. The intellectual virtues have to do with our reasoning process. All right, they're connected to our cognitive side of things. So particular virtues emerge as perfections of particular faculties, and choice is going to be the result of our interaction between the cognitive and the non-cognitive faculties. Specifically, the virtuous choice is going to be an interaction of the moral virtue and the intellectual virtue, respectively. Okay, I may have done those in reverse, but I think you know what I'm saying. Specifically, choice is the interaction between the deliberative and the desiderative faculties. Fancy term, desiderative just refers to our desires. Okay, so the choice that we're after is going to be what we call a right choice, and that has to do with whether or not we have the right deliberation and the right desires, whatever those are. So just to throw you another chart that is overly complicated and hard to follow, I'll try to walk you through it, so bear with me. You've got the faculties on one side and the virtues in the last column. So if you look down, this is kind of set up like an outline. You'll see in the first column, number 1, cognitive, and down below, number 2, non-cognitive. And so what I put under those each were the different faculties. So the cognitive faculties, you've got things like sensory faculties and intellectual faculties. The sensory or perceptive faculties are things like, the ability to grasp particular things, right? With our senses, our touch, our taste, our seeing, our hearing, those grasp particulars. Our intellectual faculties grasp the abstract universals. They abstract rather from particulars, the universals that we grasp. So not just this man, but the concept of man itself. And then the intellectual could be further broken up between theoretical and deliberative. Bold-faced deliberative, pay attention there. Jumping down further, we've got the non-cognitive. So under that, we've got the desiderative and the vegetative. And of course, the desiderative has to do with our desires, basically our appetites and emotions. So pay attention, I bold-faced the word desiderative. Now, you'll notice that I have arrows going from deliberative over to determines possibilities, and desiderative determines the good. So our desires kind of pick out what we think is good, and our deliberation, or deliberative powers, try to determine what are the possibilities open to me to attain that good thing. Okay, now when I look further, I've got these other arrows, these straight arrows, not the curved arrows, but the straight arrows go in the other direction, moving from the deliberative, practical faculties and the desires each come up and to meet each other. So we talk about our deliberative reasoning and our desires causing a union. So that's what I see in the second to last column where it says choice, which is a union of desire and deliberation. That's what a choice is. As a matter of fact, we can call a choice a deliberate desire. And then, of course, the last column, we've got the virtue. So intellectual virtue goes with the cognitive. Moral virtue goes with the non-cognitive. Spend some time with that. Freeze it. Like I said, go to the PowerPoint if you have it. Study that. If you could see the outline, this is actually, I think, a very helpful chart just to understand how things line up. And the interaction, which is what we're about to talk about. So let's kind of, I don't know if we're getting near the end. I'm probably going to stop fairly soon, but I really want to delve into this idea of the practical syllogism and this whole idea of human choice. The premises, and the reason, if you've studied logic, I may have gone over this in the beginning of the semester, what a logical argument is, or a deductive argument. There are different types. There are different types of syllogisms. A syllogism is a formal argument where you move from premises, usually two premises, to a conclusion. And what we're really doing here is we're showing how the process of making a choice is similar to a logical argument. Okay, this is more of an analogy. It's a practical syllogism as opposed to an argument. Now, the premises here happen to be the good and the possible, or we could say the desires and the deliberation. Okay, so the practical syllogism, let's lay out. It's a formal device for connecting our desires to our choices. And the general form is the major premise is our desire. The minor premise is our cognition. What's possible to do, what we can reason about doing. Maybe I should take reason out for the time being. And our conclusion, when those things come together, our desires and our cognition, is going to be an action or a choice. It depends on what goes in at the cognitive level, because there are different things. If you refer back here, under cognitive, you've got sensory and intellectual powers. So, for example, if X desires E, the end to be achieved, and X perceives or believes that this action is going to be sufficient to get E, then X is going to perform action A, and they're going to do so, we'd say, voluntarily. And that's going to be true for animals, children, and adults, though Aristotle is going to distinguish animals and children from adults at a certain way. So our syllogism for animals and children is going to be the same. You start with the desire as your major premise, but in the minor premise, your cognitive premise is going to be your perception, right? Your possible courses of action, and then you're going to act. So you think of a child who has the desire out of hunger for a cookie, and they perceive across the kitchen the cookie jar. Not thinking they're going to, even if they've been told don't take the cookie, they see the cookie. A lot of times they can't stop themselves. They're going to voluntarily, even though I said they can't stop themselves, they're voluntarily going to go and act upon that desire and take that cookie. It's because they're acting at this perceptive level, or this perceptional level. Whereas adults have a different input there. So we've got the desire that we start with, what we're after, and then we've got the deliberation, which is the intellectual aspect of, how am I going to get the right means to achieve that end. And we call this a choice. Once you deliberate, once you apply your reason, it's not merely an action, it's a choice, which is still voluntary, both action and choice are voluntary, but they're different types of voluntary actions. So the choice, again, is going to apply to adults, and it's a function of our desire and our deliberation. When we bring those two things together, we have the choice automatically made. So in a way, we could even say this is deterministic as a model. So choice, like I said, we could call that deliberate desire, or desiderative reasoning, or thoughtful desire. Lots of different ways to say it, where we've taken the cognitive and the desiderative, desiderative aspect and brought them together. All right, so what we choose always comes from our rational deliberation. When X is open to listening to how our desires are to be achieved, deliberation occurs, and then the choice follows. So, like I said, choice is a voluntary action. Choice is always of something for something. Right? It's always a choice of an action for a goal. It's a means to an end. We're desiring to aim at something, and then the reason allows us to actually put that aim on target. Okay? And of course, the choice could be to either do or not to do, right? So there's two choices. All right, in the middle of the screen, this is the point that I was making a second ago. I didn't realize it was coming up so soon, but this idea that choice is determined. We talked before in the beginning of the semester that determinism seems to be something contrary to the ability to be a free actor, and kind of interferes with the ability of morality in general and the possibility of ethics. But that only is if you're a non-compatibilist. Aristotle is a compatibilist. So when we talk about your choice being determined, we're simply saying that it merely follows, like our logical argument, the conclusion of all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. That conclusion follows necessarily from the premises. And we talk about this as a practical syllogism, and those premises conclude in a choice, okay, necessarily so. So that choice is, of course, going to be consistent with the reasons and the desires that are the input. So the choice is a necessary conclusion, like I said, and it follows from your character, because your character has to do with what we put in. Both our desires and our deliberation are functions of our character, by which you can be praised or blamed, like we said. So we could talk about this syllogism being valid, and that it does lead necessarily to a conclusion. It's valid or rational if it has the correct form, if it follows from the premises, and if the choice is going to be consistent with the desires and reason that we put in. We could talk about what's called now a right choice. Right? If we have the right desires, if we have the right deliberation, it's going to yield the right choice, and that's going to be the function of virtue. Right? So all men can make choices, but only virtuous men are going to be in a position to make the right choices, or the virtuous choices, or the noble choices. So it depends on having moral and intellectual virtue. Rational choice becomes right choice if it has the right desires. Animals and children are not acting morally or immorally necessarily, but adults are held responsible because they've got the ability to reason about these things. Okay, so right choice is the choice, like I said, of the virtuous man. A virtuous man is going to be rational, intellectually virtuous, and the choice is going to be consistent with their reason and their desires. And the virtuous man is generally going to be patient to deliberate. Right? You have the characteristics of not rushing rashly to a decision without thinking it through. They're going to deliberate well, not carelessly. They can consider the right things. They're going to be the master of themselves, their passions. They're going to be having those desires in order. And then they're going to follow through with the choice that they make, ultimately speaking. And if they don't follow through, then you have what is less than a virtuous person. We'll talk about that, I think, next time. So the practical syllogism, again, of the virtuous man is input, primary premise, major premise, right desire, or our moral virtue. Minor premise, our right deliberation, or our intellectual virtue. And now when our choice comes about, we call it the good choice, the noble choice, the virtuous choice, and not just a choice. The minor premise, like I said, is the noetic, or the intellective premise. Is your deliberative aspect, discriminates regarding what to think about, reasons well, and is ultimately morally neutral, but is going to reason in respect to moral issues because of the desires that we're dealing with. There are two types of deliberative intelligence. You've got prudence and astuteness. Prudence is the ability that we aim at the noble action, the right action, virtuous thing. Astuteness is just aiming at the best action when it comes to non-moral matters. So Aristotle distinguishes between the two. We're obviously concerned with prudence or wisdom because that's the one that is involved in making the noble choice or the right choice, morally speaking. Now, in making choices and deliberating, there are different types of deliberation. I forgot this was in here too. I'm going to cover this before we close for the day. But types of deliberation might be such as means to end deliberation. Here, we're reasoning about how to reach the goal that we have in mind. We're not reasoning about what the end is. We know what we're after. We need to figure out, how do I get there? So, for example, health is the goal that the physician is seeking. How do you make the person healthy is what you're deliberating on. Victory, we know, is what the warrior or the soldier is after, but how do you attain that is what you reason about, all right? But you never reason about whether you want health or victory, right? So that's the idea of means to end deliberation. How do I get to the end that I already know that I want? Number 2 is constituent means end deliberation. Here we're reasoning about what conforms to the end. I know in general what I want, but I don't necessarily know what that looks like. All right, so it's not deliberation about the end, but looks for an action that constitutes the end or the ideal. The action pertaining to the end is actually part of the end. So, for example, say I desire to visit the oldest city in the U.S. Now, I have to reason about what matches that description. Okay, what is the oldest city in the U.S.? Right, St. Augustine, Florida. If I think it's Atlanta, Georgia, then I'm going to get to the wrong place. The third is risky ends deliberation. Here you're dealing with possibly or potentially conflicting ends. You may be able to attain both, but you don't necessarily, or you're not necessarily going to attain both, because there might be a risk involved. So here we're deliberating about which one we're after. For example, X doesn't want to be encumbered and X doesn't want to get wet. So the question is, do you carry your umbrella, which is a kind of a pain in the neck on a nice sunny day? Anyway, the possibilities and sort of the risky ends deliberation can be brought down into some kind of reasoning grid where we've got a 50% chance of rain or no rain. So we'll look at the possibility that it rains, possibility that it doesn't rain. I decide I'm either going to bring my umbrella or I'm not going to bring my umbrella. Well, if I bring my umbrella and it rains, then I'm dry, which is what I want, but I'm also encumbered. If it does not rain, of course, I'm still dry and encumbered. So it's the same situation both ways if I bring the umbrella. If I don't bring the umbrella and it rains, then I'm wet. I may be unencumbered, which is what I like, but I'm wet, which is what I don't want. And then, of course, if it doesn't rain and I didn't bring the umbrella, then I'm still dry, but I'm unencumbered. That's kind of the best of all possibilities, whereas the worst is number 2. And you just have to reason, kind of weighing out the alternatives. And then fourth, you've got the multiple non-compossible ends. Here you actually have conflicting ends, where both ends are not possible, and you have to decide which one you want to achieve. Maybe the example of food is a good one, where you want healthy food and tasty food. I think it is possible to find tasty, healthy food, but most of the time, this is very difficult. So, am I going to go for the healthy food or am I going to go for the tasty food? It doesn't seem like I could have both. So you're going to try to, again, minimize your losses and go for the one that makes the most sense. Then you have the ultimate end, which is eudaimonia. That's your happiness. That's what we're after all along. This is something nobody ever deliberates about at all. This is actually behind all other deliberation because every choice we make, Aristotle would believe, is towards attainment of this highest end. There is no equal. It's not a means to anything beyond itself. All other ends are instrumental in that they get you towards it. Not that they're not valuable in themselves. All right, this is not, again, like I said, Epicurus' version of eudaimonia. But, what constitutes that's going to be another question. Now, the soundness of this syllogism, like I said, the practical syllogism is sound if it's valid, meaning if it contains the right premises, the moral virtue and the intellectual virtue, then it will have the proper content. Now, at that point, or at this point, I'm going to stop since we've talked about the sound practical syllogism. Next time, we're going to pick up and we're going to talk about the virtuous man, the vicious man, the incontinent man, and delve a little bit further into the issues that we're dealing with. But I think that's a lot, and I'm going to stop for today. So next time, we'll finish up with virtue ethics. So good luck. Think about this stuff, and I'll see you next time.